I'll never forget the day. It was September 23rd, 1984. It was exactly 1 week to the day after my father's birthday. And it was of the few times I can remember my father and I actually being in church together at the same time. It was probably the first time I could remember. The others being my first wedding and then my ordination. It was the day of my baptism. There were 5 of us that day who had come forward to be baptized in the chancel and the baptistry of First Christian Church in Winder, Georgia. 3 boys, 2 girls. The boys would come out of the wooden doors on one side of the baptistry where we had changed clothes into our baptismal robes, and the girls were coming out a wooden door on the other side of the baptistry. Now, it wasn't my first time in the baptistry, but probably the first time, well, it was the first time that I'd been in there when there was water. Because you see, the baptistry in First Christian Church Winder is the best place to hide when you're playing hide and seek in the church. Now, in the tradition in which I was raised, we practice believer's baptism. That means that no one brought us to be baptized, whether as infants or small children. It was up to us. We decided when we were going to enter into the baptismal waters. It was preceded, of course, by the confession of faith. And if all of this sounds awfully Baptist-y to you, well, it kind of is. Because when you grow up in the South, it doesn't matter what kind of church you go to, it's all going to sound kind of like the Baptist church. You go to the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, there's some Baptists there. You go to the Methodist Church, there's some Baptists there. You go to a Presbyterian church or one of the few UCC churches there, there's going to be some Baptist church inbred into the mix in the theology. Even if you go to the synagogue on Saturday, there's going to be some Baptist church somehow, some way. We came to be baptized as a group because that is what we wanted. We were the group that came down to make our profession of faith weeks earlier as a part of a revival. We were a part of the I'll go if you go group. Faith-based peer pressure at its best. My pastor and mentor, Don Manning, had prepared us for what to expect. He said, "Don't worry, the water will be warm. You look straight ahead. Don't look out into the congregation. You look straight ahead. Bend your knees and your back. I will hold you. I will not drop you. Do not, whatever you do not pick your feet up off the bottom of the baptistry. And if by some way you do, don't just start flailing about." Now it all went smoothly. And I went that day because that is what you do when you're between the ages of 10 and 14. There was all of the typical talk, the symbolism of the water, the cleansing, the new life, symbolic of Jesus' death and resurrection. And all of this took place under a massive 30-foot tall stained glass window above the baptistry depicting the baptism of Jesus. And at the top of the stained glass there was the dove. It was a beautiful day. And for the first time on that day in a long time, perhaps if ever in my life at the time, I felt a part of something much larger than myself. I felt that I was now standing in the midst of others who had gone before me and others who would someday come after me. Now, we don't know how many people came to be baptized by John that day, but we just know it was more than one. In fact, it was probably quite a few, probably 100 at least. We know it was a lot of people. And when all the people were baptized, says Luke, there, standing among them, was Jesus. He was not set apart that day for baptism. There was no private event that was unique to Jesus. There was Jesus just waiting his turn in line like everybody else. And you can't help but wonder why. Why was Jesus baptized? Why was he needing to be baptized? Now, John was baptizing for the forgiveness of sins. So what does that say about Jesus? Well, actually, it says a great deal. And you have to look not only with whom he stands, but from whom Jesus comes. Because after his baptism account, Luke gives to us the genealogy, the family tree of Jesus. Now, Matthew does that too in his gospel. But Luke gives a little bit different one with a different purpose. Luke's genealogy of Jesus takes us all the way back to Seth, son of Adam, the son born as a replacement of Abel after his murder by his brother Cain. You see, Jesus is descended from, as one scholar says, a line of tragic choices and destructive actions. Jesus is descended from a line of tragic choices and destructive actions. A group of flawed and fragile heroes. The Christ child was not just born into a broken place, but his heritage, like our own, contains within it brokenness and woundedness. And in the midst of that woundedness and brokenness, just as he was standing among all, his baptism stands among a world which sometimes, perhaps more often than any of us would wish, is broken and hurting. He was not seeking forgiveness for the sins of his self or for his own woundedness as much as he was for everyone else, because there in the midst of all of it stood the one God had sent to be flesh and to dwell among us and with us, all of us. Because that's who this Jesus is. He stands among the broken and the hurting and those who are often ignored. He stood among all the people that day, showing that his ministry was not just for God's people, but among and with God's people. Now, when he came to me to be baptized one day, he was 78 years old. And I will say, to this point in my life in ministry, it's my favorite baptism I've ever done. 78 years old when he came to me and said, I finally want to be baptized. Now, I was surprised at this because I'd seen him in church a lot, and I had just assumed that he, like everyone else, had already been baptized. You're not baptized? I said, no. He said, just never got around to it. May I ask, why not? Been fishing. Now, come to find out, he was raised in the faith by his mother and father, and he was taught all the stories of God in the Bible and so on, but he was born in the Depression, and so they lived so far out in the country, away from any church, that they couldn't even afford to go. And he grew up, and he went to work, and he served in the army, and then he went back to work and raised a family. And weekends were for fishing. And he said, I just figured I'm due. I said, okay. He said, "There's just one issue." "What's that?" I said. "I'm afraid of going underwater. I don't want to be dunked. I don't want to be immersed." I said, "Okay, let me get this straight. You fish almost every day of your life, yes? You get in a boat in the middle of a lake to do this, right?" "Yes." "And you're afraid of the water?" "No, just going underneath the water." I said, "Well, that makes sense." I said, "I got an idea." So we got into the warm waters of the baptistry that day. The waters come up to your waist for those of you who have never been in a baptistry. The waters are warm, they're comfortable. Read some scripture, offered a prayer, and I took one of my chalices that I have in my office. And as he stood there standing next to me, I took the chalice and I dipped it in the water and I just poured it over his head in the baptistry, baptizing him into the church universal. And it was beautiful. It was one of the most, as I've said, one of the most beautiful things and the most beautiful baptism I've ever performed in my ministry thus far. But it wasn't without controversy. Because you see, there was this one lady who complained that the baptism might not be valid, since I poured the water and he wasn't dunked. Well, Jesus was immersed. Church people can be funny sometimes, can't they? But I didn't care. I didn't care because a 78-year-old man came to be baptized into the church universal. Not because he felt that he had to, not because of peer pressure, but because he wanted to be, as a sign of his faith and a relationship among God's people. A 78-year-old man, beloved. Beloved. You know, Jesus' baptism is a means of saying, just as I am beloved by God, so are you. And I find it very interesting that the voice in Luke, when it speaks, we conclude only to Jesus. It is an intimate moment between God and Jesus, post-baptism. "You are my beloved," the voice says. "With you I am well pleased." Now in Mark, when Mark talks about Jesus' baptism, that voice comes as a part of what seems to be some supernatural vision that Jesus has as he's rising out of the water. The heavens are torn apart and the Spirit descends like a dove. And then there is that voice, as if it's some kind of epiphany or revelation for Jesus. Now Matthew talks of Jesus' baptism, and it feels more like a public announcement. This voice that says, that's not just for Jesus to hear, but it's heard by others. Not "you are my son, the beloved," but this is, as if to say to those who have gathered, "This is Jesus, my beloved, with whom I am well pleased." But here in Luke, there is something different. It was not through the act of baptism that Jesus heard the voice, but it was within the spirit of prayer following that Jesus heard the voice, reminding us that it is through those moments of deep intimacy with the holy and the sacred that we are most often reminded of our status as beloved. Jesus, fresh out of the water, goes to pray. And in prayer, the Spirit is upon him. And in prayer, the Spirit is upon us. And we discover our status as beloved. There was no dove, no voice on the day I was baptized, and that was disappointing. I did not go immediately off into the wilderness for 40 days to face temptation. We all went to lunch, and we ate a lot of fried chicken. And I guess maybe the chicken took the place of the dove. I don't know. And after church, there were pats on the back, a lot of hugs from my Sunday school teacher saying, "I'm so proud of you." Maybe those were the voices saying, "I am pleased in your beloved." The voice of God through God's people. You know, we all have our own ways of expressing the beloved nature of another and embracing our own status as beloved children of God. But sadly, there are some who never experience either. They see no sense of value within themselves. All they ever hear are words of judgment and criticism coming from the mouths of others. But here's the thing. Our baptism must have meaning. It matters not how you were baptized. It doesn't matter if someone brought you as an infant to be baptized before the church, or if you made the choice yourself to enter into the baptismal waters. It doesn't matter if you were sprinkled or dunked. It has the same function and purpose. Because just as Jesus stood among all the people that day, waiting in line for his baptism, so should we stand among all the people. Our baptism calls us beyond these walls of comfort and pushes us out to be among all people, into the woundedness and brokenness found within the lives of others. Now, on my first trip to Ferguson in St. Louis back in the spring, I stayed out at the Cheshire Hotel there at Clayton Road in Skinker, where they meet. And from there, over the course of my couple of days here, I would make many trips back and forth between the hotel and out here to Ferguson. And always, I mapped it out on my GPS, and it gave me about 3 or 4 different ways that I could come. But I always took what appeared to be the straightest shot, which is to drive right down Skinker, past Forest Park, crossing the Delmar Divide. And of course, Skinker changes names several places along the way until it finally comes and turns into Jennings Station Road, where it meets at West Florissant. And I took a left and came down West Florissant until I came to the church. Now, I was told that there's a quicker way, maybe not a shorter way, but a quicker way, that I could have just gotten on 64 and gone up 170 and hit 270 and come over to West Florissant that way, and it would have dumped me off right at the church. But I said no, that's okay. I'm not looking necessarily for the quickest way. Well, time is money. No, that's not my point. Because you see, if I would have gone up 64 into 170 and 270 and over to West Florissant, I would have missed seeing the community. I wouldn't have seen Forest Park and the Delmar Divide and how the roads and the neighborhoods and the houses and the communities transition once you cross Delmar into a new part of the community. I would have missed all of that. I would have missed seeing where all the people live and work and how they live and how they work. I just would have seen buildings and interstates and cars. Sure, 64 to 170 and 270 to West Florissant may have been easier. But it's always easier to overlook what we don't want to see. And I hear people say from time to time, well, there but for the grace of God go I. Let me go ahead and tell you, I do not like that phrase. And if I hear that phrase, I'm liable to call somebody out on that phrase. Because when you say, there but for the grace of God go I, what you are really saying, if you stop and think about it, is God's grace is with me, but it's not with this person over here. Because the only thing that makes me different in my situation different than this person over here is God's grace. Well, let me tell you something, church. That is not how grace works. And that is not how God works. Because it suggests that God's grace is not alive and well working in that person's life. Why? Because it's not your experience? But you see, God's grace is among all the people. And who are you and I to say what that looks like and feels like? We worship the one who on this day, on the day of his baptism, came and stood among all the people. And he waited his turn. And he didn't ask for any special treatment. So much of the ministry for us here at St. Peter's is for God's people, and that's beautiful, and it's amazing, and it's life-changing and life-saving. But in order for it to be most faithful, that ministry must be with and among, because that was the witness of Jesus. As much as his ministry was for, it was always with and among. And if that's what Jesus' ministry was, then so it should be ours as well. To proclaim to everyone, rich and poor, sinner and saint, you are beloved.